What's happening, triathletes? Welcome to the AC Tri Coaching. I'm Coach Ray, and in today's video, we'll be talking about cadence. Should you spin to win, or should you match for cash? Now, as triathletes, you've probably heard this from a lot of cycling coaches, probably a few triathletes as well, who suggest that you should get your cadence up to 90 or get it as close to as 90 as possible. My question is, why 90? Why not 60? Why not 80? Why not 100? Who came up with this number 90? And is there any research which suggests that 90 is the optimal cadence? So without further ado, let's dive straight into the video and see what the research has to say about it. So this very first research paper looked at the preferred cadence of professional cyclists, and what they observed was that they adopted a cadence of 90 or higher during the group and time trial stages. However, they adopted a cadence of 70 or higher during the high mountain passes. The paper also went on to suggest that the reason they adopt high cadences is to meet the demands of the competition, because the peloton is holding speeds of 43-44 kilometers an hour, and these cyclists are already running a 53-54 two-chain ring in the front. If they tried holding these speeds at a lower cadence, they would actually have to move up to a 62 chain ring in the front. Now, this paper also went on to suggest that the professional cyclists during the high mountain passes could actually pedal at a slightly faster cadence. However, for reasons unknown, they still adopt a cadence of around 70 RPM. Now, this is really interesting because a lot of cyclists and triathletes have this impression that they should get their cadence up to 90 even on the hills. But what we can see over here is that professional cyclists actually adopt a lower cadence of around 70 RPM on the hills. Now let's move on to the next research paper. Now this research paper over here suggests that lower cadences are actually inefficient for professional cyclists. However, this paper also went on to mention that there is research which shows that the optimal cadence increases as the power output increases, and this paper also suggested that the optimal cadence is probably between 50 and 70 for cyclists producing less than 200 watts. Now let's keep this in mind over here because age group triathletes are not pushing close to 300 watts. The majority of age group triathletes I know are pushing less than 200 watts. So moving on to this research paper over here. Now this research paper tried finding out if there was an optimal cadence for cycling, and what they concluded was more of a hypothesis which suggested that during prolonged cycling, that is road time trials, may benefit from a slightly reduced cadence between 90 and 100 RPM. And during ultra-endurance cycling, performance might be improved through the use of a relatively lower cadence between 70 and 90 RPM, since lower cadences have shown to improve cycling economy and lower energy demands. Now this is really interesting because what this paper is proposing is that as the duration of the event gets longer, you should actually reduce your cadence. So if you're training for an Ironman, you would expect your cadence to be lower than if you were training for a sprint triathlon. Now as triathletes, we may or may not be concerned with what is considered economical or optimal. What we really care about is how do we get from point A to point B in the quickest or the shortest amount of time. So this next research paper over here had cyclists perform an 8-kilometer time trial using a cadence of 60 and 100. And what they found was that lower cadences produced a faster 8-kilometer time trial. Besides having the faster time, the lower cadence group also had a lower heart rate. Now this research paper looked at the cardiovascular responses between low cadence high force versus high cadence low force cycling. And they essentially had groups of cyclists bike at 150 watts at different cadences. And what they observed was that the lower cadence group actually had a lower heart rate than the higher cadence group. Now this is something what we saw in the prior research paper as well, which suggested that lower cadences produce a lower heart rate. Now let's talk about this paper for a minute. Let's assume you're an age group triathlete who does not have access to a power meter, and you're racing with a heart rate monitor and a speed cadence sensor. And somewhere in training, you determine you want to keep your heart rate below 145 beats per minute on the bike on race day. Now, what's going to happen on race day is if you try and adopt an unusually higher cadence, you reach 145 beats a lot sooner than if you adopted a lower cadence on a harder gear. And what's going to happen is once you reach 145 beats per minute using a higher cadence, you'll essentially have to back off to get your heart rate down. And once you back off in an easier gear, you're actually pushing less watts and you'll end up with a slower bike split. Now, as triathletes, our goal should be to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible in the shortest amount of time. We shouldn't be really concerned with what the cadence is, because what we really care about is how we got from point A to point B and if it was in the shortest time possible. Alright, so we looked at the heart rate response to various cycling cadences, but as triathletes, we also have to run after we bike. So the more important question is, does cycling cadence impact our running performance? Now, this paper looked exactly at that. It had athletes bike at a low cadence, a self-selected cadence, and a high cadence. And what they found was that irrespective of the cycling cadence chosen, it actually had no impact on your running performance. What they also observed was that the lower cadence group actually had a lower heart rate, And this is something what we saw in the prior research paper as well. Now, some of you usually put on an argument which suggests that you cannot run well off the bike if you bike at a lower cadence. But we just saw a research paper state that cadence does not impact your running performance. And if you look at real world examples, Mirinda Carfree, Daniela Reef, Chrissy Wellington, they're all known for pushing a big gear and they all run amazingly well off the bike. Alright, so now we looked at a few research papers. Now let's look at a few power files from Kona and see what kind of cadences are athletes adopting. So we have Marybeth Ellis, who held 177 watts for a cadence of 73. Yana, she was an age group triathlete. I can't pronounce her last name. She held 182 watts for a cadence of 79. Then we have Sarah, who held 207 watts for a cadence of 83. Pete Jacobs, 281 watts for a cadence of 91. Lionel Sanders, 299 watts for a cadence of 87. Now I know the sample size isn't large enough, but if you think about it, the smaller athletes, the women, are pushing a lower wattage, which is expected, but they also have a lower cadence. The men, the larger athletes, are pushing close to 300 watts, have a higher cadence. And this is something what the research paper suggested as well, that your optimal cadence tends to go up as your power output increases. Yet we have age group triathletes trying to imitate professional cyclists and try and get their cadence as close to 90 as possible. What we need to keep in mind over here is that age group triathletes aren't pushing 300 watts or 350 watts for that matter. The age group athletes I know are barely pushing 150 or 200 watts. So if the optimal cadence tends to go up as the power output increases, it makes no sense for an athlete to be trying to accomplish a cadence of 90 with only pushing 200 watts or 150 watts. Alright, so we've looked at research papers, we've looked at power files, we've looked at anecdotal evidence. Now the question is, what is the optimal cadence for a triathlete? What's the optimal cadence for you? Well, in my opinion, the optimal cadence is going to depend on three factors. The first factor is the course. If you're racing a hilly course like Ironman St. George, you can expect your cadence to drop. And that is something what we saw in the first research paper as well, which suggested that professional cyclists generally adopt a lower cadence of around 70 RPM on the high mountain passes. The second factor is going to be how many watts you're pushing. So if you're pushing close to 300 watts like Lionel Sanders, you will have a higher cadence. But if you're only pushing 150 watts, you'll probably have your cadence somewhere around the 70s. And the third factor is actually your training history. If you've done a lot of low cadence work in training, you will have a relatively lower cadence than someone who's never done low cadence work. So it's a combination of these three factors which will determine the optimal cadence for you. Now on race day, I don't suggest to try and strive for an unusually high or an unusually low cadence. Whatever cadence comes to you naturally on race day is probably the cadence you should race at, because that cadence is probably determined by these three factors I just spoke about: how many watts you're pushing, what the terrain is, and what your training history is. Alright guys, I hope I've been able to debunk this myth of 90 as the optimal cadence, because I honestly did not come across a single research paper which suggested that 90 was the optimal cadence. It seems as triathletes we try and imitate professional cyclists because we look up to them, but what we don't realize is that professional cyclists are pushing close to 350-400 watts on race day. They are training upwards of 20 hours a week. As age group triathletes, we can barely get in 3 to 4 sessions a week. We also have to swim and run. And let's not forget that at one point in time, professional cyclists such as Lance Armstrong were actually busted for doping. They were using EPO and testosterone. So it's not realistic for us to try and imitate or try and replicate their training. Alright guys, I hope you guys found this video informative. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, leave it in the comment section below, and I'll see you guys next time.